In the unforgiving heart of the Arizona Territory, a place where the sun baked secrets into the cracked earth, and every shadow could hide a rattlesnake or a rifle, a lone woman's life was about to be fractured. Adeline Rosewood, a widow bound to a lonely homestead, by grief and grit believed she had already faced the worst the frontier could offer. But when a brutal thunderstorm washes a near-dead man onto her land, his body a canvas of violence, and his face a mask of fierce pride, she makes a choice. In nursing this dangerous stranger, she isn't just inviting trouble into her home. She is sheltering a secret that could set the entire territory ablaze. The sky over the Dragoon Mountains had been the color of a fresh bruise for most of the afternoon. Adeline Rosewood watched it from the small, sturdy window of her cabin, her hands paused in the act of kneading dough. Dust fine as powdered cinnamon puffed up from the plains with every gust of wind, a prelude to the violence to come. It was the monsoon season of 1883, a time of savage, unpredictable temper tantrums from a sky that was otherwise relentlessly blue and unforgiving. Her homestead, a modest timber cabin and a small, struggling corral, was nestled in a shallow basin near Willow Creek, a name far more generous than the trickling stream deserved for 10 months of the year. It was isolated, a solitary testament to a dream that had died with her husband Thomas 2 years prior. A fever had taken him, swift and merciless, leaving Adeline with nothing but the cabin. He'd built a stubborn mule named Clementine, and a silence that was often deeper and more threatening than the howl of a coyote pack. When the storm finally broke, it was with the force of a cavalry charge. Rain didn't fall. It was hurled from the heavens in solid wind-driven sheets that hammered against the roof and turned her dusty yard into a roiling sea of mud. Thunder cracked like a celestial bullwhip, and lightning seared the landscape in stark, momentary tableaus of white and black. Adeline was not a woman easily frightened. The frontier had scoured away her softer edges, replacing them with a quiet resilience. She lit a kerosene lamp, the warm yellow glow pushing back against the frantic strobing twilight outside, and continued her work. The rhythmic press and fold of the dough was a comfort, a familiar act in a world gone mad. It was during a particularly violent clap of thunder, one that shook the very foundations of the cabin, that she heard it. It wasn't the storm. It was a sound wholly unnatural, a grating, desperate cry swallowed almost immediately by the wind. She froze her knuckles white in the dough. It could have been a mountain lion, its cry, sometimes mistaken for a woman's scream. It could have been the wind playing tricks on the eaves of the barn. But it had sounded human. Curiosity warred with a primal instinct for self-preservation. Thomas had always warned her, "In this land, Addie, what you don't know is the only thing that might keep you alive." But another voice, her father's a doctor back in Ohio, whispered differently. To ignore a cry for help is to lose a piece of your own soul. The storm raged for another hour before its fury began to wane, settling into a steady, percussive drumming on the roof. The screaming had not come again. Adeline, unable to settle, pulled on Thomas's old oilskin coat, grabbed the heavy Winchester rifle from its pegs by the door, and stepped outside. The air was cool and smelled of ozone and wet earth. The world was a mess of running water and slick red mud. She moved cautiously, her boots sinking into the muck the rifle held at the ready. She checked on Clementine, who was restless but safe in the small barn, then began a slow, deliberate circle of her property line, her eyes scanning the churned-up ground. She found him near the creek bed. The recent torrent had turned it into a small, angry river, and it appeared to have washed him up against a cluster of half-drowned mesquite bushes. At first he was just a shape, a dark heap of buckskin and flesh indistinguishable from the other debris. But then a flicker of lightning illuminated the scene, and she saw the unmistakable form of a man face down in the mud. He was Apache. There was no mistaking the high cheekbones, visible even through the mud, the long jet-black hair, matted with blood and debris, or the simple practical design of his moccasins and leggings. A wave of cold, sharp fear washed over Adeline, more chilling than the rain. The newspapers in the nearest town of Verde Creek were filled with tales of Apache raids of violence and bloodshed. Settlers spoke of them as ghosts, fierce and untouchable, the sworn enemies of progress. Her finger tightened on the trigger of the Winchester. The logical safe thing to do was to retreat to her cabin, bar the door, and wait for morning. He was likely dead anyway. If he wasn't, he was a threat, plain and simple. She took a half-step back, but then a low moan, a sound of pure animal agony, escaped his lips. He was alive. Adeline's feet felt rooted to the muddy ground. She saw not a warrior, not an enemy, but a human being drowning in his own blood. The doctor's daughter in her overpowered the fearful homesteader. With her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, she laid the rifle down in a patch of grass, safe from the worst of the mud, and knelt beside him. She worked her hands under his shoulders, straining with the effort. He was heavier than he looked, all wiry muscle and solid bone. With a great heave, she managed to roll him over. His face was a horror. A deep gash ran from his temple down his cheek, caked with drying blood and mud. But it was the wound in his side that was killing him. A dark, ragged hole in his buckskin tunic oozed blood, staining the earth beneath him a sickening dark crimson. A gunshot. He was burning with fever, his skin hot to the touch, even in the cool, rain-soaked air. His eyes fluttered open. For a heartbeat, they stared into each other's. His were black, bottomless, and filled not with fear, but with a defiant, burning rage that startled her. It was the look of a trapped hawk, a king in a cage. Then his eyes rolled back, and his head lolled to the side. He was unconscious again. Adeline stood her mind, racing. Bringing him into her home was madness. It was a death sentence if anyone found out. Sheriff Brody was a fair man, but the townspeople, whipped into a frenzy by recent conflicts, would form a mob. They would see her as a traitor. Yet leaving him here was to condemn him to a slow, agonizing death. The coyotes would find him before morning. She looked at his face again, at the proud, harsh lines, softened by unconsciousness. She saw the tremor of a chill run through his powerful frame. In that moment, he was not an Apache warrior. He was just a man, broken and dying at her feet. "God forgive me," she whispered to the weeping sky. Making a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of her life, she picked up her rifle, trudged back to the barn, and returned with the mule and a length of rope. Getting the unconscious man onto Clementine's back was a Herculean task that left Adeline trembling with exhaustion, her muscles screaming in protest. He was a dead weight, and the mule, sensing the strangeness of the cargo, was skittish and uncooperative. But Adeline was resolute. She finally managed to secure him, a grim parody of a sack of grain slung over the saddle, and led the mule the short distance to her cabin. Inside, she slid him carefully onto the bearskin rug in front of the hearth. She couldn't risk staining her own bed with mud and blood. The fire had burned down to embers, and she quickly added fresh logs, coaxing the flames back to life. The flickering light played over his harsh features, casting deep shadows in the hollows of his cheeks. For the next several hours, Adeline Rosewood became the doctor her father had always hoped she would be. She stripped away the sodden, blood-caked buckskin, her movements clinical and detached. She had seen Thomas in the throes of his final illness, had tended to his failing body, and that experience had burned away any sense of maidenly modesty. This was a body broken and in need of mending. His physique was startling. He was lean, but his chest and arms were corded with long, hard muscle, his skin covered in a roadmap of old, faded scars. This was a man whose entire life had been a battle. She found the bullet wound in his right side, a nasty torn entry point just below the ribs. There was no exit wound. The bullet was still inside him. Her father's medical bag had been one of the few things she'd insisted on bringing west. She retrieved it now, its worn leather, a comforting presence. With boiled water and carbolic soap, she cleaned his wounds, her touch gentle but firm. The gash on his head was deep but clean. She stitched it closed with a steady hand, the small needle dipping in and out of the coppery skin. The bullet was another matter. Probing for it would likely kill him. Her father had taught her that sometimes the best a healer could do was clean the wound, fight the fever, and let the body's own strength do the rest. She packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow to staunch the bleeding and willow bark for the fever, then bandaged his torso tightly with strips of clean linen. All the while she worked under his silent, unconscious gaze. He was a canvas of contradictions, the savage violence of his wounds against the quiet stillness of his body, the fierce, proud set of his jaw even in oblivion. She found herself noticing small details, a small, intricately beaded amulet tied around his neck, with a leather thong, the way his long fingers curled slightly, as if gripping a weapon he no longer held. She fed him sips of willow bark tea, prying his lips open and tilting his head. For 3 days he drifted in and out of a feverish delirium. He would cry out in a language she didn't understand, guttural sharp-edged words that sounded like commands or curses. He thrashed against her hands, his strength terrifying even in his weakened state. During those moments, Adeline felt the true weight of her decision. She was alone miles from any help, with a man who could kill her with his bare hands if he chose. She slept in her rocking chair, the Winchester loaded and resting across her lap. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. She awoke from a shallow doze to find him staring at her. His eyes were no longer clouded with delirium. They were clear, sharp, and intensely intelligent. The raw rage was gone, replaced by a watchful, assessing calm that was in its own way even more unnerving. Silence stretched between them thick and heavy. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the ticking of the small mantel clock Thomas had bought her. He didn't speak. He simply watched her, his gaze missing nothing. The fraying cuffs of her dress, the exhaustion etched beneath her eyes, the rifle still held loosely in her lap. Adeline's throat was dry. She stood slowly, deliberately setting the rifle against the wall, a clear gesture of non-aggression. She ladled some broth from the pot simmering on the hearth into a bowl. She approached him cautiously, as one might approach a wolf that was no longer caught in a trap, but was still cornered. She knelt and offered him the bowl. He stared at it, then back at her. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion in their dark depths. Poison a trick. She understood his hesitation. She dipped the spoon into the broth, brought it to her own lips and swallowed. Then she offered it again. His eyes held hers for a long moment before he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The simple gesture felt like a treaty being signed. Moving with a painful slowness, he pushed himself up into a sitting position, his jaw clenched against the agony from his side. He took the bowl from her, his hand surprisingly steady. He drank the broth slowly, deliberately, never taking his eyes off her. When he was finished, he handed the bowl back. His fingers brushed hers, and his skin was calloused and warm. It was the first time they had touched when he was conscious. The contact sent a strange jolt through her, a startling awareness of the man himself, not just the patient. He gestured with his chin toward the bandages on his side. Then he looked at her, his expression a clear, unspoken question. "You did this?" Adeline nodded. "You were shot. The storm washed you into the creek." Her own voice sounded strange in the quiet room. He absorbed this, his face, impassive. He looked around the small cabin, his gaze lingering on the neatly stacked books, the faded photograph of her and Thomas on the mantel, the carefully tended geraniums on the windowsill. His inspection was thorough, as if he were memorizing every detail, assessing every threat and every advantage. He finally spoke. His voice was a low rasp, rough from disuse, but carrying an undeniable undertone of authority. "Why?" It was a single word, but it contained a universe of questions. "Why save me? Why risk yourself for an enemy? What do you want?" Adeline met his gaze directly. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was joined by something else, a stubborn defiance. She had made her choice, and she would not apologize for it. "I couldn't leave you to die," she said simply. He held her gaze for another long moment, searching for deceit, for pity, for something he could understand. Whatever he found, it seemed to satisfy him for now. He leaned his head back against the wall, a flicker of exhaustion crossing his features, and closed his eyes. The interrogation was over. A fragile, unspoken truce had been declared in the fire-lit silence of the lonely cabin. The days that followed settled into a quiet, watchful routine. He remained on the bearskin rug by the fire, a still and formidable presence in her small home. He never spoke unless she spoke first, and his answers were brief, clipped, and offered no more information than was absolutely necessary. His silence was not empty. It was heavy, filled with observation. Adeline felt as though she were a specimen under glass, her every action noted and analyzed. She learned his name on the second day of his consciousness. "I am Adeline," she had said, tending to the dressing on his side. Adeline Rosewood. He watched her hands, his own resting loosely at his sides. After a moment, he replied, "Kyle." The name sounded strange on his lips, almost foreign. It was a simple, hard sound, like a stone striking stone. It wasn't an Apache name, she knew that much. She wondered if it was a name he used with white men, a shield to protect his true identity. She didn't press. His recovery was astonishing. The resilience of his body was a marvel. Each day he grew stronger, the feverish weakness replaced by a coiled, latent power. He began to move around the cabin, his steps slow and deliberate, at first his hand often pressed to his bandaged side. He walked with a natural grace that was mesmerizing, a predator's economy of motion. A fragile, unspoken trust began to form, built not on words, but on actions. He watched her cook, and when she burned her hand on the cast-iron skillet, he was on his feet in an instant, gesturing towards the aloe plant on her windowsill with a look of urgent concern. She in turn learned to read his moods. A certain tension in his shoulders meant his wound was paining him more than usual. A distant look in his eyes meant his thoughts were far away with his people, his world. One afternoon, a small wren flew into the cabin through the open door and began fluttering frantically against the window pane, trying to escape. Adeline moved to shoo it out, but Kyle held up a hand, stopping her. He rose slowly, his movements fluid and silent. He approached the terrified bird, murmuring to it in his own language. The words were soft, musical, a stark contrast to the harsh commands she'd heard in his delirium. He cupped his hands gently around the wren, held it for a moment, and then walked to the door and opened his palms. The bird soared into the sky, free. He watched it go, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. In that moment, Adeline saw not a fierce warrior, but a man with a deep intrinsic connection to the natural world. The outside world, however, refused to be kept at bay. On the 6th day, the sound of hoofbeats sent a jolt of alarm through the cabin. Kyle was instantly alert, his body tensing his hand, instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Adeline rushed to the window, her heart in her throat. 2 riders were making their way up the faint track that led to her homestead. They were white men, rough-looking, with rifles slung in their saddle scabbards. A cold dread washed over her. "Get down!" Kyle's voice was a low, urgent command from behind her. Away from the window. She obeyed without question, her mind racing. Who were they? Prospectors? Drifters? She dropped to a crouch beside the hearth, her gaze darting towards the Winchester on the wall. Kyle was already moving despite his injury. He flattened himself against the wall next to the door, a place where he would be invisible to anyone peering inside. His eyes were cold, hard points of light. The patient was gone. The warrior was back. The riders stopped just beyond her fence line. One of them, a big bearded man with a stained duster and cruel, small eyes, called out, "Hello, the house, anyone home?" Adeline's mind spun. If she didn't answer, they might get suspicious and come in. If she did, what would she say? Her voice, she was sure, would betray her terror. "Answer him," Kyle whispered, his voice barely a breath of sound. "Tell them your husband is away. Tell them to leave." Adeline took a shaky breath, pressing a hand to her chest to still her racing heart. She rose and walked to the door, opening it just a crack. "Can I help you?" The bearded man smiled, a greasy, unpleasant sight. "Just passing through, ma'am. Me and my partner, Gus. We're looking for someone. An Apache buck. Ran this way after a little disagreement a few days back. Shot up pretty bad. You ain't seen anyone like that, have you?" The man's name was Jebediah Kane. He was a bounty hunter, known in the territory for his brutality and his utter lack of scruples. Adeline had heard his name whispered in Verda Creek. The blood drained from her face. These were the men who had shot Cale. She forced herself to meet Kane's gaze. "No," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "No one's been through here, just me and my stock." Kane's eyes roamed over her, then past her, to the dark interior of the cabin. "You all alone out here, ma'am? A pretty thing like you. It's a dangerous land for a woman on her own. My husband is in Verda Creek for supplies." She lied the words, tasting like ash. "I'm expecting him back before sundown." Kane's partner, a wiry man named Gus, with shifty eyes, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "We lost his trail in that flash flood. Washed everything clean. But he's hurt. Can't have gotten far." "Well, he's not here," Adeline said, her tone sharp with a desperate manufactured confidence. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have chores to attend to." She made to close the door, but Kane held up a hand. "Hold on now. We've been riding all morning. Mighty thirsty. You wouldn't begrudge a couple of thirsty men a dipper of water from your well, would you?" It was a test. A refusal would be suspicious. A nod meant they would be on her property, closer to the cabin, able to see or hear something amiss. From his hiding place, she could feel Kyle's stillness, a palpable, dangerous tension that filled the small space. "The well is over there," she said, nodding towards it. "Help yourselves, but please be on your way after. My husband is a jealous man." Kane laughed, a grating sound. "I bet he is." The 2 men dismounted and ambled over to the well. Adeline watched them, her back rigid, every nerve screaming. Inside, Cale was a statue carved from granite. He knew, as she did, that their lives hung on this thin, fraying thread of a lie. The minutes stretched into an eternity as the men drank, watered their horses, and spoke in low tones, their eyes constantly scanning the homestead. Finally, with a last, lingering look at the cabin, they mounted up. "Much obliged, ma'am," Kane called out, tipping his hat with mock politeness. "If you do see a stray Apache, well, there's a handsome bounty on his head. Dead or alive." He wheeled his horse around, and they rode off, disappearing over the rise. Adeline didn't move until they were completely out of sight. Only then did she close the door and sag against it, her legs trembling so violently she could barely stand. Kyle emerged from the shadows. The cold fury in his eyes was terrifying. He walked to the window and watched the direction the men had gone, his jaw tight. "They will be back," he said. It wasn't a guess. It was a certainty. "They did not believe you." He turned to look at her, and his expression softened slightly as he took in her pale, shaken state. He walked to the water bucket, filled a dipper, and handed it to her. "You were brave," he said quietly. Adeline drank the water, her hand shaking. "They're the ones who shot you." "Yes," he said, his eyes like flint. "And they will not stop until they find me. You are in danger now, Adeline Rosewood. Because of me." The shared threat had solidified their fragile alliance into something stronger. They were no longer just a healer and her patient. They were two people bound together against a common, ruthless enemy. The silence in the cabin was no longer one of mistrust, but of shared peril. The visit from Jebediah Kane and his partner shattered the quiet sanctuary of the homestead. The air was now thick with a constant simmering tension. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Adeline found herself sleeping even more lightly, the Winchester never far from her hand. Kyle, for his part, seemed to draw strength from the impending danger. He was more alert, more focused, his movements imbued with a deadly purpose. He insisted on testing his strength, pushing himself to walk the perimeter of the cabin, to heft the heavy axe, his face a stoic mask hiding the pain it surely caused him. He was no longer just healing, he was preparing. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, Adeline was cleaning the rifle on the porch, the familiar scent of gun oil filling the air. Kyle sat on the steps, sharpening a small skinning knife he'd had tucked into his moccasin, a weapon Adeline hadn't even known he possessed until after the bounty hunters had left. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel was the only sound. "You know how to use that?" He stated not a question, but an observation, his eyes on her practiced movements. "My husband Thomas taught me," she replied, her voice soft. "He said a woman alone in this territory needed to know how to shoot straighter than she could pray." Kyle grunted a sound of grim agreement. He was a wise man. "He was a good man," she corrected gently. A comfortable silence fell between them. It was in these quiet moments that the chasm between their worlds seemed to shrink. She was no longer just a white woman, and he was not just an Apache. They were two people in a shared predicament. "They will come back soon," Kyle said, his voice low. "Perhaps tomorrow, perhaps the day after. They will not search aimlessly. They will come here." "What will we do?" Adeline asked the question, hanging in the twilight air. He tested the edge of the blade with his thumb, his expression thoughtful. "When they come, you will not be here." Adeline stopped cleaning the rifle and looked at him. "What are you talking about?" "This is my home. It is a wooden box in a valley. Your home is your life." He countered, his gaze intense. "You will take your mule and ride east at first light. Ride until you reach the town. You will be safe there." The The thought was dizzying. Abandon her home, everything she had left of Thomas. And you, what will you do? I will wait for them, he said simply, his voice devoid of any bravado. It was a statement of fact. This is my fight. It does not belong to you. A hot surge of anger surprised her. You think I would run after everything I lied for you? I tended to your wounds. I am as much a part of this as you are now. Those men, they will not just be looking for you. They will be looking for the woman who helped you. He looked at her truly, looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond stoicism in his eyes, respect and perhaps regret. You have a warrior's heart, Adeline Rosewood, but this is a battle you cannot win. Then we will lose it together, she said, her chin set stubbornly. He stared at her for a long time, the dying light casting his face in sharp relief. The harsh lines seemed to deepen, etched with a gravity she had never seen before. He finally put down the knife and the sharpening stone. You do not know who you are protecting, he said, his voice taking on a different timbre, a formality that made her shiver. You have a right to know the name of the man you are willing to die for. He rose to his feet and stood before her, not as the wounded patient Kyle, but as something more. He seemed taller, his presence filling the porch. The last rays of sunlight caught the beaded amulet at his throat, making it gleam. The name I gave you, Kyle, it is a name for the white man's world. It has no meaning, a convenience. He paused, his dark eyes fixed on hers. Among my people, the Chiricahua, I am known by another name. They call me Nan Ton. The name meant nothing to her, a string of foreign syllables. She looked at him confused. He saw her confusion and clarified his words, dropping into the quiet evening like stones into a deep well. It is not a name. It is a title. It means leader, chief. Adeline felt the world tilt on its axis. The rifle stock suddenly felt cold and heavy in her hands. She stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of his words. The man she had pulled from the mud, the man whose wounds she had stitched, whose fever she had cooled, was not just a random Apache warrior pursued for a bounty. He was a chief, a leader of the very people her world considered its most dangerous and intractable enemy. The elusive, almost mythical figures spoken of in Verde Creek with a mixture of fear and hatred. He was a man who likely commanded hundreds of warriors, a man whose decisions could mean life or death for settlers and soldiers across the territory. The bounty on his head wasn't just for murder or robbery. It was for who he was. Capturing or killing him would be a major victory for the army, a cause for celebration among the settlers. And he was standing on her porch. The quiet man who had gently freed a trapped bird was also a man who led his people in a desperate, brutal war for survival. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity, the aura of command that clung to him even when he was near death, the way he assessed every situation, with a strategist's eye, the sheer indomitable will to survive. "Chief," she whispered the word, the sound foreign on her tongue. He gave a slight solemn nod. "My people are in the mountains searching for me. The men who shot me were not bounty hunters by chance. They were hired to remove me, to break the spirit of my band." Adeline sank onto the porch steps, the rifle resting against her knees. The personal danger she was in had just magnified 100-fold. This was no longer about sheltering a fugitive. This was about harboring an enemy of the state, a king in hiding. Sheriff Brody's fairness wouldn't matter. The army would get involved. They would burn her cabin to the ground and ask questions later. She looked up at him, at the proud, unyielding set of his face. He was watching her, gauging her reaction. He expected her to recoil, to finally understand the folly of her compassion and run. But as the initial shock subsided, it was replaced by a strange, steely resolve. The revelation didn't change the fact that Jebediah Cain was a cruel and venal man. It didn't change the fact that she had looked into this man's eyes and seen not a monster but a human being. The stakes were higher, the danger more profound, but the fundamental truth of her choice remained. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Nantan's brow furrowed. "It matters more than anything." "No," she insisted, meeting his gaze. "It doesn't change what is right. They are coming to murder a man on my land, and I will not let them." A long silence passed between them. A look of profound surprise, mingled with something akin to awe, crossed the chief's face. He had revealed his greatest secret, expecting it to drive her away in fear. Instead, it had forged her resolve into something as hard and unbreakable as the mountains themselves. He had offered her an escape, and she had refused it, choosing instead to stand with him. In that moment, Adeline Rosewood, the quiet widow of Willow Creek, became an unlikely ally to the chief of the Apache. The dawn broke grey and tense, the air unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. Nantan's prediction had been correct. Adeline had barely finished her morning coffee when she saw them, two riders, cresting the familiar rise outlined against the pale sky. It was Cain and Gus. And this time they were not coming to ask for water. "They are here," Nantan said, from his position by the window. His voice was calm, a stark contrast to the frantic hammering of Adeline's heart. He was no longer Kyle the recovering patient. He was Nantan the war chief. He moved with a newfound vitality, the last vestiges of his injury burned away by the fires of imminent combat. "Bar the door," he commanded, and the window shutters. "Check your rifle." Adeline moved with a swiftness born of adrenaline. She dropped the heavy wooden bar across the door, the sound echoing with finality in the small cabin. She secured the shutters on the two small windows, plunging the room into a dim, striped twilight, lit only by the hearth and her single kerosene lamp. The world outside was reduced to thin slivers of light. She checked the Winchester. It was fully loaded with a box of cartridges on the table beside it. Nantan had taken her small skinning knife. He had also taken the heavy wood-splitting axe from the block outside the previous evening. It now leaned against the wall next to him, its polished edge gleaming menacingly in the lamplight. "They will try to talk first," he said, his voice a low murmur. "They want to see if I am alone, if I am still weak. Do not answer." As if on cue, Jebediah Cain's voice boomed from outside. "Rosewood, we know you're in there, and we know who you're hiding. Send out the Apache and the woman lives. We have no quarrel with you, ma'am, but you're harboring a wanted murderer." Adeline flinched at the lie, but remained silent, her eyes fixed on Nantan. He stood perfectly still, listening, his head tilted like a wolf discerning the direction of a threat. "Last chance, woman," Cain yelled, his voice closer now. "We know he's wounded. This can be easy silence." Adeline held her breath. The silence was shattered by the deafening roar of a rifle shot. A splinter of wood exploded inward from the heavy door, whining past Adelina's head to thud into the opposite wall. She cried out, stumbling back. The floor Nantan snapped, pulling her down. "Stay low." Another shot tore through the window shutter, then another through the door. They were testing the defenses, trying to intimidate them. Nantan crawled silently to one of the shuttered windows, peering through a small crack. There are two of them. Cain is by the well. The other Gus is moving toward the barn. He will try to set it on fire to smoke us out. Panic seized Adeline. The barn held Clementine. her mule, her only transport, one of her last living connections to Thomas. "We have to stop him," she whispered urgently. Nantan looked at her, then at the Winchester in her hands. "Can you shoot as your husband taught you?" She nodded, her throat tight. "Yes." "Good," he said. "The back window looks upon the barn. When I give the signal, you will open the shutter just enough to aim. Do not try to kill him. Hit the barn door close to him. Frighten him. Drive him from cover." He crawled back to the front of the cabin. "I will deal with Cain." Adeline crept to the small rear window, her rifle feeling impossibly heavy. She rested the barrel on the sill, peering through a crack. She could see Gus, a wiry silhouette, darting from the cover of the corral fence toward the barn, a flaming torch in his hand. Now Nantan's voice was a sharp hiss. Adeline took a deep, shuddering breath, unlatched the shutter, and swung it open a few inches. She lined up the sight not on the man, but on the weathered wood of the barn door just to his left. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the explosion deafening in the enclosed space. Outside, she heard a yelp of surprise and the clatter of the torch falling to the ground. Gus scrambled back behind the fence, abandoning his attempt. Adeline quickly slammed the shutter closed and barred it, her heart pounding. "He is back in cover," she reported, her voice trembling. From the front of the house came Cain's enraged roar. "So the little lady has some bite, fine. We'll do this the hard way." A volley of shots peppered the front of the cabin. Nantan remained unnervingly calm. He waited for a lull in the shooting. "He is angry," Nantan murmured almost to himself. "Anger makes a man careless." He moved to the hearth and picked up the heavy iron fireplace poker. He then took one of Adeline's spare bonnets from a peg on the wall. In a move that was both bizarre and brilliant, he pushed the poker up into the bonnet and slowly, carefully raised it into one of the bullet holes in the shutter. To the men outside, it would look like a person cautiously peering out. The reaction was immediate. A rifle cracked, and the bullet tore through the fabric of the bonnet. Nantan immediately let it drop. "He has fired," Nantan said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. He grabbed the heavy axe. Now he reloads. In a single fluid motion, he unbarred the front door, kicked it open, and launched himself outside. It happened so fast Adeline barely had time to register it. He moved not like a wounded man, but like a bolt of lightning. She scrambled to the open doorway in time to see the tableau. Jebediah Cain stood near the well, his rifle broken open, as he tried to chamber a new round. His face was a mask of pure shock and terror as Nantan bore down on him, the axe held high. Cain fumbled with the cartridge, his eyes wide. He was too slow. Nantan did not use the blade of the axe. He swung it like a club, and the heavy flat side of the axe head crashed into Cain's shoulder with a sickening crunch of bone. The rifle clattered to the ground. Cain screamed a high, thin sound of agony and collapsed. From the barn, Gus opened fire, but his panic made his aim wild. A bullet kicked up dirt near Nantan's feet. Nantan didn't even flinch. He bent down, scooped up Cain's fallen rifle, and in one smooth motion, spun and fired from the hip. He wasn't aiming to kill. The shot struck the top rail of the corral fence, sending a shower of wooden splinters into Gus's face. Gus shrieked and fell back, clutching his eyes. He was blinded, disoriented, and utterly terrified. His nerve broke completely. He scrambled to his feet and ran, stumbling blindly toward the horses. He managed to haul himself onto his saddle and spurred the animal into a frantic gallop, disappearing over the rise. Silence descended, broken only by Cain's pathetic, agonized groans from the ground. Nantan stood over him, the captured rifle held loosely in his hand. His chest was heaving, and a line of sweat beaded on his brow, but his eyes were like chips of obsidian. He was the chief again in full command. Adeline ran out, her own rifle still in her hands. She looked from the whimpering bounty hunter on the ground to Nan Tan, who stood like a bronze statue of vengeance. He had just defeated 2 armed men with little more than a knife and axe and a cunning strategy. She was in awe of his ferocity and his control. He looked at Cain with utter contempt. "Your life is mine. I should take it for what you have done." Cain sobbed a puddle of mud and misery. "Please, I got a family." Nan Tan stared at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Adeline, at her home, at the bullet scars on the wooden walls. He turned back to Cain. "Your life is worth nothing," Nan Tan said, his voice cold. "But this woman's home is not a place for butchery. Your partner has fled. You will do the same." He gestured with the rifle barrel. "Get on your horse and ride. If I ever see you in these mountains again, I will not be so merciful." Stumbling and crying, using his good arm, Cain managed to pull himself onto his horse. He gave Adeline a look of pure, venomous hatred, then spurred his horse and followed his partner, a broken, defeated man. Adeline and Nan Tan stood alone in the sudden ringing silence, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air. The siege was over. They had won. But as Adeline looked at the damage to her home, she knew the fight was far from finished. They had revealed themselves. The world now knew the Apache chief was at Willow Creek. The aftermath of the siege was a heavy, ringing silence, broken only by the whimpering of the wind through the new bullet holes in the cabin walls. Adeline and Nan Tan moved in a shared, unspoken rhythm, the violence they had endured having forged a bond deeper than words. He helped her clear the splintered wood and spent cartridges, his movements economical, despite the strain on his healing wound. The air between them was different now. The space between patient and healer, between Apache and white woman, had vanished. In its place was the stark, undeniable truth of 2 allies who had fought for their lives side by side. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, they sat at her small table. The immediate threat was gone, but the larger danger loomed like a thunderhead on the horizon. "Gus will go to Verde Creek," Adeline said, her voice flat, breaking the long silence. "Or worse, he'll ride straight to the fort." "He will go to the fort," Nan Tan confirmed, his gaze fixed on the darkening mountains. "The bounty is nothing compared to the glory of leading the army to a chief. They will come. Not 2 men, but a troop." A cold dread settled in Adeline's stomach. A troop of cavalry. "You have to leave," she urged, her voice low and intense. "Now, while there is still time. Take my mule. Go deep into the mountains where they cannot find you." He turned to look at her, and his dark eyes held a profound, soul-wearying sadness. "And leave you here to face them. They will not believe you are a victim. They will see the bullet hole that came from your rifle and call you a traitor. You chose a side, Adeline Rosewood. In their eyes, you chose mine." He was right. The terrifying reality of her situation crashed down on her. She was an outcast, a collaborator. Her simple life was over, destroyed by a single act of compassion. Before she could absorb the finality of it, Nan Tan stiffened. He rose from his chair in a single fluid motion, his entire being focused on the darkening hills. "They are here," he whispered. Adeline's blood ran cold. "The army, so soon." "No," he said, and for the first time a note of profound relief entered his voice. "My people." She joined him at the open door, peering into the twilight. At first she saw nothing but the familiar shapes of mesquite and rock. Then they materialized from the shadows as if woven from the dusk itself. A dozen silent figures on wiry ponies appearing on the ridgeline. They were wraiths of the twilight, moving with a silent, coordinated grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. They fanned out, forming a protective semicircle around the homestead, their watchfulness transforming her small patch of land into a military encampment. One warrior detached himself and rode forward. He was older, his hair streaked with grey, his face a mask of dignified concern. He dismounted and approached, his eyes fixed on Nantan. A volume of unspoken questions passed between them before the warrior spoke in the low, guttural tones of the Apache tongue. Nantan replied, his voice calm, but filled with the unmistakable authority of a chief. He gestured toward the cabin, then at Adeline. The warrior's gaze shifted to her, and it was sharp, assessing, and deeply suspicious. In his eyes, she was not a savior. She was a white woman, a potential captor, an enemy. Nantan spoke again, his tone firm and commanding. As he explained, pointing to the bandages still visible beneath his torn tunic, the warrior's expression slowly changed. Suspicion gave way to a grudging understanding, and finally to a flicker of respect. He gave a stiff, formal nod to his chief, and then to Adeline. "This is Dakota," Nantan said to her. "My brother's son. He has led the search." The time for farewell had come. His people were here. The safety of the mountains called to him. He stood before her on the porch as his warriors prepared for their departure into the night. "You saved my life," he said, his voice low. "My people and I are in your debt." "I only did what was right," she whispered, her heart aching with a strange and unexpected sorrow. "Few in your world would agree," he corrected gently. He reached for the beaded amulet at his neck, the one she had noticed when he first arrived. He untied the old leather thong and pressed the cool, smooth stone into her hand. It was a piece of turquoise, intricately carved with the shape of an eagle. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "It is a symbol of protection in my family. Show it to any Chiricahua, and they will know you are under my watch. They will know you are a friend." He closed her fingers around the amulet. "The army will come. Tell them what you must to survive. But you cannot stay here. Your life in this place is over." She looked down at the stone, then back up at his face, memorizing the proud, harsh lines in the fading light. "Where will I go?" His dark eyes held a deep sadness for her. "The world is larger than this valley. You have a warrior's heart, Adeline Rosewood. You will find your way." Without another word, he turned and swung onto his pony with an easy grace. He looked back at her one last time, a long, unreadable gaze that spoke of gratitude, respect, and a bridge that had been built between their worlds, however briefly. Then he turned his horse toward the mountains. Followed by his silent warriors, he melted back into the shadows from which he came. Leaving Adeline alone on her porch, the turquoise amulet clutched in her hand, forever changed by the storm that had brought a chief to her door. 2 days later, the cavalry arrived, led by a sharp-eyed Captain Beaumont and guided by the vengeful bandaged bounty hunter, Gus. A troop of soldiers surrounded the homestead. Adeline met them on the porch, her spine straight, her calm exterior, a mask for the pounding in her chest. In her pocket, her fingers found the smooth, cool turquoise of the amulet, a secret source of strength. She told her story, a carefully constructed lie, woven around a core of truth. She was a doctor's daughter, she explained, bound by oath to help the wounded. The Apache had been delirious, and she, a lone woman, had been his unwilling nurse. When the bounty hunters attacked, their violence provided the chaos he needed to escape into the hills. Captain Beaumont's interrogation was relentless. His questions like daggers, but her story held firm. His men searched the bullet-scarred cabin and found ample evidence of a fight, but nothing to prove she was more than a victim. Frustrated and without proof, Beaumont finally led his men into the mountains, leaving Adeline in a ringing silence. Nantan's parting words proved prophetic. Her life at Willow Creek was over. The whispers that followed the soldiers from Verde Creek grew into a chorus of accusation. She was no longer the grieving widow. She was the traitor, the Indian lover. This new bitter isolation was a prison far harsher than her former loneliness. Within a season, she sold the homestead to strangers who knew nothing of its violent secret. After a final silent goodbye at Thomas's grave, Adeline Rosewood, with her father's medical kit and the Apache amulet, boarded a stagecoach and vanished into the northern horizon. She rebuilt her life in the raw territories of Montana, becoming a respected nurse in a mining town, where questions about the past were rarely asked. She never saw Nantan again, but she listened as legends trickled up from the South stories of a brilliant Chiricahua chief who eluded the army for years, a leader known for his ferocity in battle, but also for inexplicable acts of mercy. The soldiers and settlers all called him Nantan. On cold, clear nights, Adeline would look toward the southern mountains, her hand closing around the amulet. She lived a quiet life, but she was never truly alone. And sometimes, on a still morning, she would find a single eagle feather on her windowsill, a silent message on the wind, a whisper from a world she had touched, assuring her that she would never be forgotten. The story of Adeline Rosewood and Chief Nantan is a testament to the fact that the true history of the West wasn't just written by cowboys and cavalry, but by the quiet, momentous choices of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. It's a story of compassion in a time of conflict, a reminder that the line between friend and foe can be blurred by a simple act of humanity. Theirs was not a romance, but a rare and powerful alliance of two worlds, a secret bond of respect forged in the heart of the fire. The legacy they left wasn't one of treaties or territories, but the quiet truth that a single act of courage can echo through the generations. If their story moved you, please help us share more tales from the forgotten corners of history by hitting the like button. Share this video with someone who loves a powerful story, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the dramatic, untold stories that shaped the American West. Thank you for listening.